Good afternoon. Welcome to uh, Business 101, Introduction to Business. You may or may not be able to see me on the screen, which is not really that important. Just didn't get the frame over far enough, so you may see me and you may not see me. We're going to discuss the first three chapters of in Understanding Business, the text you have this evening. And we're going to talk about chapter 1, taking risks and making profits in a dynamic business environment. Chapter 2 will discuss economics and how it affects businesses. And chapter 3 we'll talk about global trade. Now let's look at the learning outcomes, learning objectives for this first chapter. Describe the relationship between profit and risk and show how businesses and nonprofits can raise the standard of living for all. Compare and contrast being an entrepreneur and working for others. Analyze the effects of the economic environment and taxes on businesses. Describe the effects of technology on businesses, which, as you should know, is changing even as we speak. Just demonstrate how businesses can meet and beat competition. Analyze the social changes affecting business. We'll talk about that throughout the course and get into that somewhat in the marketing chapters. Identify what businesses must do to meet global challenges, including war and terrorism. We probably don't have too many answers there, but it's something that businesses have to be concerned about. And then review how past trends are being repeated in the present and what those trends mean for tomorrow's college graduates. All right. Goods and services. Businesses offer goods and services. Goods are something we can hold in our hand, we can see, we can feel, we can do some other senses that we have. And they're things that we know, clothing, cars, not technology, but certainly computers. So we're using one here this evening. Services, on the other hand, are intangible products, something that we cannot see. And education is an intangible product. An insurance policy is an intangible product. Recreation is listed here on the slide as an intangible product. So to be able to do business here in any of these areas, either selling goods or selling services or selling both, as some do, where do I say some do? Dell Computers, for instance, and Apple falls in the same category, and perhaps Microsoft and IBM and some other large companies sell both product and service. So you need to be able to get those in front of the people that you're talking to, and then make sure that they know what you're talking about and be able to promote them. Business is any activity that provides either goods or services, and it is operating to make a profit. Now, of course, yes, we do have nonprofit organizations. We'll talk about them just a little bit later. But in business, you're in business to make money, and if you're not, you don't need to be in business, or you need to think about maybe being a nonprofit if you could do that. An entrepreneur, and we'll refer to entrepreneurs more than once in the course, is a person who takes a risk. He or she risks a number of things: time, money, etc., to start a business, operate a business, and eventually make a profit. Successful businesses, and again we'll return to this, have a product or a service that serves a niche, and you are either satisfying a want, products that people want, or a need, something that they have to have. What are needs? Needs are things that everybody must have. Must have shelter. You must have food. You have to have some kind of transportation, and a few other things. A want, you will see this in several of our videos. For instance, pillow pets. Somebody wanting a pillow pet for their child, or a child wanting a pillow pet, that's not a need. Nobody has to have a pillow pet. It's not like food. It's not like shelter, but it's something that people want. Now, here are three things to look at here on this slide. Revenue, that is different from profit. Revenue is the amount of money that an organization takes in, a business takes in, over a certain period of time selling its products, goods, if you prefer, or services. Profit is everything that that business has left after it has paid its overhead. Overhead include taxes, salaries, rent, utilities, things of that nature. A loss is simply when you have more going out than you have coming in. Now there is risk, and by the way, we're going to talk about risk more fully somewhat throughout the course, but also when we get to the bonus chapters. And we're going to talk about risk because risk is something that every company has to factor in when it's doing its business. And notice here what this particular one talks about is speaking only of an entrepreneur, but we can extend that to any business. That is the chance that that business will lose something. We'll lose profit, we'll lose revenue, the business may never become profitable. So we have to think about that. It also talks about every business doesn't make the same amount of profit. I think that's a given. Something we're going to find as we go throughout our, not only this course, but as we go out through our lives. Some people do better than others. And it's something that we have to think about that. Notice here it talks about businesses taking risk, and with the greater the risk, the more chance of money, earning a greater profit or a greater percent of profits. And that's true. And we have to think about that. So with risk comes a payoff, but it's not always the same payoff that we would like to have. This is a laundry list of how your tax dollars are used. I don't intend to go through that, but it's something that we pay for. And we Americans always have railed about taxes. We went to war for our independence of taxes, among other things. But you look at this list and think to yourself, what is it that I don't want to have, so I don't want to pay taxes for? I don't want to have a library. I don't want to have playgrounds for my children. I don't want to have fire and police protection. That's what our tax dollars go for. Standard of living. We talk about this. There's a weekly question to upload to the forum section about standard of living. Standard of living simply boils down to what it is we can buy with the money we have. It's as simple as that. We in the United States have a very high standard of living. Not the highest, but we do have a high standard of living. Notice also that while people in other countries may want additional money, their standard of living and what they can buy with that is not quite as great as the opportunities and the wide array of products that we can buy for ourselves in this country. Quality of life just talks about what it says here, our well-being. And one of the big things to remember about our well-being is freedom. We have unlimited freedom in this country to do certain things. We have unlimited freedom to start a business and keep all the profit for ourselves. We don't have to share that with anybody. And we have an unlimited amount of time, most of us do, for leisure time. We don't think about that, but we do. One of the next items that we want to talk about here are stakeholders. I always caution students, and I caution myself when I say this, we don't want to think, excuse me, I got back to the wrong slide here. We don't want to think of stakeholders as being the same as stockholder. A stockholder can be a stakeholder, but not all stakeholders are stockholders. And notice the list here. Stakeholders are anybody who has a vested interest in that company. It could be employees, it could be customers, it could be the government, It could be the area in which the company operates. Any number of people are considered stakeholders. And it simply means that those folks have a vested interest in that company doing well, and they can either gain or lose depending upon how well the company does. In this particular slide, just gives you typical stakeholders. This is depicted in your text at the bottom of page 6. We will talk a great deal more about outsourcing as we go through this course. This, as you know, is a huge issue in the United States and has been for a number of years and will continue to be because many companies, to maximize their profit, believe that it's less expensive for them to move their facilities offshore outside the United States and do their manufacturing and some other type things. Many companies may not do their manufacturing there, but their call centers are are located, what I meant to say, outside the United States. Philippines, India, and a few others are high on that list. Insourcing is just the reverse. That's a foreign company bringing its operations to the United States. And we don't always think about that, but what companies do that? Toyota does, Honda does, BMW does. There are a number of other companies, I only mentioned car manufacturers, that bring their operations to the United States. And they operate in the United States. Toyota, for instance, has a large facility in Georgetown, Kentucky, which is about 70 miles from where I'm seated right now here in Cincinnati, Ohio. Honda has a plant in upstate Ohio and has another plant over west of here in Indiana. Nonprofit organization is just a reverse of a business that's operating to make money. A nonprofit organization has an agenda. They usually have an issue that they're trying to solve or to help solve. And yes, they do take in money because they have to have money to operate, but at the end of the day, they don't make a profit. We'll talk more about that, and that understanding of a nonprofit will probably be better brought to your attention when you review the video about goodwill, which is at the end of chapter 18. This particular slide just gives you a listing of well-known nonprofits, and I don't intend to spend any time on that because we don't need to do that. One of the things that nonprofits need to be concerned about is that their employees tend to burn out because it requires a great deal of passion to get into work for a nonprofit. And so nonprofits have to be concerned about that. And it's something they need to really worry about and make sure that they have ambitious goals, but they're not over the top. And notice this last, which makes my point, they need to give people a break. These are the ups and downs of entrepreneurship. We talked a little bit about some of this just a few minutes ago, but the big thing is that you're free to do whatever you want. You can start the business today and end it tomorrow. Nobody's going to make you do that. Nobody's going to tell you you can't. Now, having said that, yes, you may go someplace and there may be zoning restrictions and things of that nature. But on the whole, you're free to do whatever you want to do. Make your own decisions. Nobody's going to get in your way. Now, that's if you're an entrepreneur and you do not have a partner. And of course, on the opposite side, you can fail. And there are other things that are probably more important here that you need to think about. And some of those fall into quality of life. One is you don't get a vacation. You don't have any insurance. No daycare. Hello? So you need to think about those before you become an entrepreneur or decide that you want to become an entrepreneur. Now, having said that, that is not meant to dissuade you from becoming an entrepreneur. What it is meant to say to you is, and we're going to talk about entrepreneurs as we go through the course, as I mentioned before, you need to be realistic, and you need to make sure that you're well grounded before you get started. And we'll talk about that more when we get to chapters 5 and chapter 6. Anybody can take the entrepreneurial plunge. You don't have to be a certain type of person. Yes, you do. You have to be a person who's a go-getter, but you don't have to be certain age. You don't have to look a certain way. You don't have to come from a certain community. You don't have to have X number of dollars or anything else. It's anybody who decides that he or she wants to take the plunge and start a business. This talks about women in the workforce. I'm not going to go through that because that's just what I consider a gee whiz slide, and that's not meant to be smart aleck or throwaway, but that's really what is important about that slide more than anything else is that we have more women in the workforce today than we've ever had in the history of the United States, and that's to our betterment. This particular slide is a slide you should remember to take with you, not that this is testable or anything else. These are the 5 factors of production. Companies and countries need to have these 5 factors if they intend to be successful. Successful as a country, successful as a company. You'll notice that the 5 factors are land, labor, capital, meaning money, entrepreneurship, which we just talked about here a few minutes ago, and knowledge. When I first taught this course 15, 16, 17 years ago, we didn't talk about knowledge as being a factor of production, but it has become more and more important today, especially knowledge of how to operate in the internet age that I like to use. It's very important that people know technology. They're comfortable with technology because technology has to be used on the job most places today. Yes, people still work with their hands, but in many cases, certainly on automobile assembly lines, you have to be able to operate and understand a computer because that's part of the manufacturing process. It's also part of information process of what you have to pass on to other folks.
Excuse me, Dr. Reed?
Yes. Hello?
Do you think, this is Mia Cook speaking, sir. How are you this afternoon?
I'm fine, thank you. What can I do for you?
I was just going to ask, do you think that computer skills will be a requirement in the future to obtain these jobs?
I'm sorry, what's your question again?
I said, do you think having computer skills will be a requirement to obtain these jobs in the future?
It might be. I have to say it that way because the way the business environment is very dynamic, as we're talking about here, and it changes. And what we're using today may last for another 15, 20, 30, even 100 years. But the possibility of that changing overnight is just as great as it lasting for a long period of time. I'm going to jump ahead here just a second. We have gone through a number of, in our history, only since the United States has been a country, we have gone through a number of changes within our economic environment, for lack of a better term. For a long time, we were agricultural based, and that stayed from about the beginning of, pretty much from the founding of the country, if you say 1776, or if you prefer after the Constitution was signed in 1787, up until the beginning of the 20th century, we were pretty much an agricultural society. And we changed from that into an industrial society at the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And then we moved into a service type economy that, as far as I'm concerned, really didn't last all that long. And then we're now into the information age, still within service, but the information age. And what we found is that every time we move from one type of society, agriculture, to industrial, and now to information age, we went through a lot of, I'm going to use the word angst. We didn't know how to, we didn't know how to do something with that. We were very uncomfortable with it. And what do I mean by that? We have a large percent of population in the United States that was embedded in manufacturing. And we've lost a lot of manufacturing, although we'll find out that our manufacturing is not as bad as like a lot of people like to paint it. But in some cases, in some pockets of the country, pardon me, those manufacturing jobs are not going to come back. What we've not done a very good job, I'm not talking about country, not so much business, but country. We've not done a very good job of training and educating those folks who have lost their jobs so that they can be competitive, in the new economic environment in which we find ourselves. And so that's something we really need to do, both as a country and as industries. We are finding that many large companies are saying they cannot find employees simply because they're not technologically proficient. And I'm here to tell you there are many people, and I'm sure you're one of them. I'm not being smart aleck when I say that are much more technologically proficient than I am. And I won't get into that, but we need to really make sure that people understand technology. Technology is here to help us. We've not done a very good job of getting that message across. I struggle with technology, but I use it. I'm not afraid of it. I go and get help where I need it. So we need to make sure that people understand it, because technology is really very important to how people do their jobs today. We'll talk a little bit later when we get to chapters 8 and 9, I believe, about computer-aided design, computer-aided manufacturing, and things of that nature. And so what we're saying here is that people really have to be comfortable in using technology and making sure that they use it not only to their benefit, but to the benefit of the company that they work for, or to use it as an entrepreneur. I'm not sure I answered your question, but I wanted to give you some of my thoughts anyway.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Oh, you're more than welcome. The next slide we're going to show here is business management and job creation. This is a slide that is in your text that I suggest that you look at. You can find it on page 12. I don't want to go through this, but notice that there are four. I don't want to go through it because you can look at it and see it yourself, but I also don't want to go through it because it can be kind of what we consider to be a busy slide. But there are four factors here, if you will, or four forces that impact. Those are technological, social, competitive, and economic and legal environments. And these impact on any business. And this goes back to talking earlier what I brought in, and we'll talk more of that when we get to chapter 2, about freedom of starting your own business. And one of the things that businesses want, and we have to be careful here because there has to be a good trade-off, businesses want is to have non-onerous regulations. Now, when I say non-onerous, I mean what I want you to take away from what I said here, not because I said it, but I want you to take this away because it is true. We do need regulations. We need to protect our environment, and we need to do some other things. But at the same token, we don't want regulations to stifle business creation. We don't want regulations to keep businesses from being able to make a profit. Now, that doesn't mean to say, and I don't want you to take away that I'm saying, oh, well, let's relax all the environmental pollution regulations and things of that nature. Let's do away with the Organization of Safety and Health, OSHA. Things. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that our regulations need to be smart. They need to be user-friendly, if you will, but at the same token, and at the same time, encourage other people to become entrepreneurs. As we try to move away, by the way, this is me talking, we haven't done a very good job of it, but as we try to move away from fossil fuels, coal, oil, and things of that nature, that creates new entrepreneurs to come up with ideas about things like making electric cars, wind energy, harnessing other type of energy. to do a couple things. One, hopefully to make it less expensive for us, but two, to help us protect the environment. And the third part of that is create more jobs. So we have to think about all those things. Now, this particular slide kind of talks a little bit about what I said just a minute ago about government regulations and what we're trying to do, or what government ought to be doing to help businesses along to be things. This does not talk about, and I don't want you to talk about things, don't want you to think I'm talking about relaxing regulations. I'm not. What I am talking about is making sure that we're doing things that don't put greater burdens on top of people. And obviously, that last bullet down there, minimizing corruption, that's something that really is important. There is a little, what I want to say, type of assignment thing. It's in each chapter. It's a segment that calls Ethics Begins With You. We don't do this as an assignment within the course. I did use this some years ago, but I found students struggled with it, and I wasn't getting what I was looking for, and I don't think students were getting what they were looking for, so I dropped it. But I do suggest that as you go through the text, as you read this Ethics Begins With You, it takes just a couple minutes, and just kind of think through that process, because it's very important that every business have sound ethical underpinnings. And we'll talk more about that when we get to chapter 4. Here's what we want to get out of technology: efficiency and effectiveness. Effectiveness is getting the results that we want, whereas efficiency is being able to get what we want while using the least amount of resources. Very, very, very important. E-commerce is becoming a very big thing. As you know, we talk about e-commerce, and by the way, it doesn't have to just be e-commerce to have the two things we have up here: B2C, which is business to customer or consumer, and then B2B, which is business to business. By the way, if you're interested in e-commerce, we have a very good course called E-commerce Business Planning, MIS 330, and I recommend that you consider taking it if you're interested. And I'm not trying to push you into a particular course, but if you're interested. These are things we have to be concerned about, databases and identity theft and things of that nature. We'll talk more about those as we go through the course, and I'm not going to stop and talk about them too much today. What do we need to do when we compete in any any business? Number of things we have to think about, and we're going to talk more about most of these later in the course. I don't want to spend a great deal of time on them right now, because I don't want to get someplace and they say, "Oh, I've already heard that." So I'd rather wait till we get there and be a little more fully explanatory than I'm would be right now. I'm going to talk about empowerment when we get to that in one of our later chapters. This is an issue that we must be concerned about, and that's demographics. We'll talk more in larger part in demographics later in the course, especially when we get to the marketing piece. But one of the things we have to be very cognizant of, and that is the changing demographics within our country. Right today, the majority are people who look like me. They're white. Whether they're male or female, they look like me or something like me. We're going to find out in about 20 years. Now, you'll see some data that says it's not going to happen for a little bit longer, but I think the data is not quite correct. That doesn't mean to say I'm doubting what they did or the research they went through. I just don't think the data really is correct. I think we're going to find it by 2030, which is 14 years from now, maybe just a little bit past that. We will not any longer have a majority in this country. The whites will still be the largest number, but they will not be over 50%. I may miss that by a few years, but not a whole lot. And what that tells us is that the country is changing. And as the country changes, businesses have to change to meet the changing demographics if they intend to stay profitable and in the business that they're in. Now, we have a few more slides here on demographics, pardon me, that I'm not going to go through, but it's very important to understand that. It's very important to understand our population. Our population is getting a little older. That may change to some extent. We won't see it quite as old as it is right now. I'll give you an idea about old. Japan has a population that is 25% age 65 and older, and Japan does not have a sustaining population. In other words, that is, to sustain a population or to grow, a family, a married couple has to have 2.3 or 2.4 children. I don't remember exactly which. Now, I know you can't have 0.3 or 0.4, but figuring it out, you can. If you don't have that, you don't have a sustainable population or a renewable population. We're not in that situation, but many countries are. Japan certainly is. Some of the European countries are. And the only thing that's sustaining some of the European countries is immigration. And you know what we've gone through with the immigration coming into some of the European countries in the last year, 18 months. So this is diversity. This is what makes us different. This is what brings us together as a population in the United States. We know that the global environment has changed. We also know that there's more global competition. Today, we're going to talk more about that when we get to Chapter 3. We have to think about things that affect that. That's distribution and a few other type things. This is going back to what I talked about before, the evolution of business in the United States. Notice we went from the agricultural area that I talked about, to manufacturing. I think I used the term industrial, but that's the same thing. Then we went to service, and now we're in the information-based era. So I'm not going to go through what each of those eras brought to us. What I am going to tell you is here at the end, the technology, and notice what the technology affects. It affects everything that we do in this country in business, in nonprofit organizations, and other things. Notice it affects agriculture, industry, service. There's nothing today that technology does not touch. That's not true or was not true in previous years, but it is true today. And we simply cannot turn our backs on technology. We have to make the most of it. And that is one of the things that's helped us, the United States, stay competitive as we are a leader, if not the leader, in technology across countries, across the global environment. And that's why it's so important to make sure that we bring those folks who are left behind into the technology era so that they can understand it, that they can become comfortable with it. It's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to change. None of us like to change, but we have to. And I just give you an example. You know, a few years ago, I couldn't sit here and do this because I wasn't comfortable doing it. And I'm not to be smart aleck, but I'm a great deal older than most of you listening in this evening. So I had to learn. And I always say, if I can learn, anybody can learn. Well, we were at 4:49. I want to take a few minutes break. Come back, please, at 4:52, and we'll get into Chapter 2, economics. And by the way, as we go along, you can either ask me a question on the phone or you can type a question in to the message box there, and I'll answer. So please come back at 4:52. Thank you. All right, 452, we're back. We're into chapter 2 now, understanding economics and how it affects businesses. And we're going to do some, pardon me, some comparison and contrasting of the three major economic forms that we know in the world today. Those are capitalism, which is the system that we're under. I'd like to call it market economy, market-based economy, simply because it has a nicer tone to it than capitalism. We'll also talk about socialism and communism. The learning objectives for this chapter explain basic economics, explain what capitalism and how free markets work, which is where we are, compare socialism and communism, analyze the trend toward mixed economies, which is something we're moving to, and many other in the United States and many other economies are as well. Now look at our economic system, and we'll talk about some key economic indicators, especially GDP, which is known as the gross domestic product. And then we'll look at the difference between fiscal policy and monetary policy, except I would ask you to keep what we're going to talk about in mind, and we'll talk about that more fully when we get to chapter 20. All right. Economics is the study of how people and countries use their resources to produce goods and services. Now, I noticed I mentioned both. This particular bullet up there says society, but I split society into businesses, people, and a government. So within economics, we have two branches, pardon me, macroeconomics and micro. Macro talks about a government or a country's economics because it talks about the economy as a whole. And that economy as a whole affects all of us, not just some people, it affects everyone. But microeconomics is about us. It's how we choose to use our resources, normally our assets, and normally here we're talking about money, to purchase things for ourselves, either something that we need, pardon me, as I talked about before, or something that we want. So what you need to understand about economics is it boils down to choices. If you choose to buy, pardon me, if you choose to buy item A, that means you cannot buy item B. And you say, well, no, wait a minute. I can do that. I'm gonna go out, pardon me, and borrow some more money to buy item B. Well, what that says is now you have to get a different resource that's going to cost you additional money so you can buy something additional. But normally speaking, we don't do that. Normally speaking, we buy one particular thing and don't buy something else because we don't have the resources to do that. Now, that doesn't mean we make poor choices. What that means is we make a choice and we decide we're going to buy this because we either need it or want it. And that other thing that we think about, or other things we think about, we're not going to do that today. We're going to buy them sometime later if, in fact, we decide to buy them. Resource development is just, and this talks about the study, but resource development is how we increase the resources and how we can use them better to make conditions better. And by the way, I want you to think of resources as not just being money. I want you to think of them as being people as well, because we need to educate and train people, but not just, well, train them, we're going to train them to do a job, but we like to educate them to bring them more fully into things that they need to do for themselves and other things that they can do to help mankind, to help the business, etc., to be more fully effective, be more fully efficient, to be a better participator, if you will. Now, when I say that, please don't take it that I'm saying that people don't do things. I don't mean to say that, although we know that there are people who do things better than others. But we need to make sure we're getting the maximum out of everybody that we possibly can, and we need to help those that we need to help. This just gives us new ways of thinking about how we increase resources. I'm not going to go over this a whole great deal, but we do need to think about that because we have, pardon me, we have a finite amount of resources. For instance, I talked about coal and oil before. Petroleum is probably a better term than oil. They're not going to be around forever. And we have found that in the coal industry. There are people screaming today that the coal jobs, the jobs for coal miners are gone, or they are going, or they're diminishing, or whatever the right term is you want to use. And the fact of the matter is that's true. And it's sad in a way because in some areas of this country, the only good paying job you can get is to be a coal miner. Now, let's not talk about the dangers and things of that nature. Yes, I understand all that. I'm talking about a good paying job. So why is it that those jobs are diminishing? Well, it's because at the present moment, natural gas is much less expensive than coal. It's easier to get to, it's easier to refine, it's easier to put into conduits to get to the place it needs to be. And so many energy companies, pardon me again, that formerly used coal are now using natural gas because it's less expensive. Now, I know somebody's going to say, well, yeah, but my energy bill keeps going up. Yeah, I understand that. And that's not part of this particular equation. The equation is people figure that it's better for them to use natural gas. It's cleaner burning. It reduces some of the pollution we have, et cetera. The fact of the matter is the amount of coal we've been taking out of our mines in the United States has been dropping for the last 10 or 15 years, maybe even further back than that. We're producing less coal, pardon me, we're mining less coal today than we did 10 or 15 years ago, simply because other things are less expensive. So the question is, and you hear politicians saying we're going to bring coal mining jobs back. That's not going to happen. I mean, we need to think about that. And even if it does happen, it would only be short-lived because that energy resource is going to get, the natural gas I'm talking about, is going to get less expensive, and then we're going to have other things coming in. Wind power, some other type of power that's going to make it even more difficult for coal miners. So what do we have to do there? We have, as a country, we have to go to those places and try to, the best of our ability, re-educate those folks into doing something else, and then hopefully to have the infrastructure in place. And I do mean to use that term, that companies can see that there's an area to go to and start a new industry, if you will. Thomas Malthus was a person who wasn't kind of didn't like economics in a way, and he thought that notice that the people who were wealthy had, he uses the term rich here. Let me go back to what he used. They had most of the wealth, well, and that we know that to be true for the most part, and that the poor had all the population. And because of that, he said, well, the poor people are going to cause all the resources to be used up. And so there won't be anything left over for everybody else. And those people that have it are the productive people. And so everything's going to be gone. There won't be anything around. And so that led the next person, Thomas Carlyle, based upon what Malthus had to say, to say that economics was a dismal science. Notice down here this last bullet that talks about neo-Malthusians, and that means current people today that still aspire to or follow Malthus postulates. And notice that they still think there are too many people in the world. And there are probably a lot of folks that would agree with that without following Malthus. And we do have an issue. We only have so many resources. And we have two very large countries in the world that have populations that are not that well off, or a great percent of their populations, China and India. So there is something we have to think about here, and we have to think about it. What can we do to best use our resources, etc. So we have to think about that, and that comes with populations. And notice here that this slide says that people with large countries with large populations can be a resource, but it comes down to education. It comes down to providing jobs. It comes down to providing economic growth. It comes down to providing opportunities. And what happens is, in many economies that have large populations, they don't have the wherewithal, or haven't learned the wherewithal, to be able to use that huge population as a resource, to become more educated, etc. Now, let me just digress here for a minute and talk about India. India has a good percent of India is highly educated. And one of the reasons that a lot of the service providers hook up, when you call somebody, you have trouble with service, and you wind up talking to somebody in India. One of the reasons, by the way, I don't, that might sound like I'm being smart aleck, and I don't mean to sound that way. But one of the reasons you do that, well, there are two reasons. Number one, as I said before, India has a very educated middle class, and two, Indians speak English. Now, they don't speak American English, but they do speak English. However, most of us have had difficulty speaking with those folks on the phone simply because they don't speak American English. Or for somebody like me, who is hard of hearing, and even though I do wear hearing aids, I can't understand real well over the phone. It really frustrates people. So this gets us into education. This gets us into making sure that we're doing things with the resource that we have, and resources are people, to make things better than what they are. Adam Smith is the originator of economics, I think, as we think about it, or the founder of it as we think about it. He wrote the famous book that most of us refer to as The Wealth of All Nations. Not the exact title of the book. The exact title of his book is listed on page 32 in the text, and I'm not going to go through that. We don't need to worry exactly what Adam Smith did. But notice Adam Smith talked about freedom to own property, freedom to keep profits from a business. We talked about that before in chapter 1. And notice what else he said. People will work hard if they think they're going to be rewarded. Now, reward that we think of in working hard often comes with our salary or wages, but there's a corollary there. If we work hard and we do well, we're probably going to get salary increases or bonus or both. And so we'll do what we want to do to help move things along. So here's one of the ways that then he talked about, and I skipped ahead, I'm sorry. Then he talked about something called the invisible hand. And that's a hard concept to understand, I think, and a hard concept to swallow, because they're not a bunch of invisible hands. And of course, my hand's not invisible here, floating around and making things move. But what he talked about here is self-directed gain for an individual, then transmuted or transformed other people into doing well. So here's what he was saying. If I am trying to do well for myself and have succeeded in being able to do that, I'm going to be able to, in some cases and in some way, influence other people by creating jobs, by making more product to be available for people to buy, etc. So when I've done that, I've benefited not only myself, but I've benefited the people that work for me and the greater community. And when I have done that, there is a quote unquote invisible hand that has raised the level of economics or the prosperity of a whole number of people from where it is here to somewhere where it is up here. That's kind of in essence what the invisible hand means and stands for. So, and here this takes a little bit differently than what I just said, and talks about a farmer earning money by, growing crop and then selling the crops. And the more the farmer sells, he or she has to get somebody to help bring in the crops and maybe sell the crops or get the crops to market or whatever that happens to be. And as I produce more food, there's more food for the community, and I hire more employees, which is kind of going through what I just said before, except this says it a little bit differently and perhaps a little bit better, and in a way that we might be able to understand a little bit better. The concept hasn't changed. And I'm not going to talk about how corruption harms the economy other than to say this to you. If to do business, you have to pay people off because otherwise your products won't get to where they want to do. Nobody is winning here. You're in the business of having to pay somebody to allow you to stay in business. This person is making money and he or she is not sharing that with anybody else. So we want to keep corruption out. We want to keep it to a minimum. We don't want to see people making money out of just being a strong-arm individual. Capitalism. This means that this is the economic system that we operate under in the United States. And that means that everything, or most everything, is owned by an individual or individuals. We're talking about a publicly traded company like Procter & Gamble or Kroger or General Motors or General Electric or Ford. It is owned by individuals, owned by the stockholders. And then, of course, we have other businesses that are owned solely by an individual or by a family or by partnerships or things of this nature. And countries with capitalists, or like I like to say, market-based economies, their foundations are mostly all European in origin. United States, Australia, England, Canada. Their genesis came from Europe. Not that they're European still today, but that's where their genesis came from. Here are the 4 basic principles of capitalism. And we talked about these a little bit previously, but let's enumerate because they're very fundamental, and they'll be driven home to you in the video that you're going to Opportunities International. You can own private property. You and I can own private property. You can own any business that you want as long as you have the wherewithal to start a business, and you can keep all the money, all the profit for yourself. You don't have to share it with anybody. Nobody's going to tell you to do that. Notice this next one. It's kind of hard to get this in our minds. It's a right to competition. That means that anybody can get into the same industry that you are as long as they have the wherewithal and enough resources. And then finally, you have the right to choose. You can do whatever you want, as long as it's legal. You can't do things that are illegal, but these are the 4 freedoms we have, and many other countries don't have these. Pardon me. And not only don't they, pardon me again, not only don't they have these, they don't have the concept of what this means. It's foreign to them. It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't compute. It's not there. And so it's something we need to really need to think about, and it's what set us apart. Franklin Roosevelt, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, added 4 additional freedoms. One I kind of always I'm concerned about because it talks about the freedom of speech and expression. Well, that's guaranteed by the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. And somewhat so is the second one, freedom to worship where you want, when you want, and how you want. But he did add 2 other ones, and he added these especially at the beginning when he became president at the depths of the Great Depression in the early 1930s. And that's the freedom from want and freedom from fear. And a very, very strong message from President Roosevelt at a time that the country really needed to have it. A free market, which is what we operate under, is a very interesting concept for most of us to think about because we don't think about it. And that is that you and I, all of us listening here tonight, those who are going to watch the recording, we tell businesses what to make. Nobody else does. And, we can think about this in a way of automobiles, if you will. There are some automobiles that are no longer available. There are some makes of an automobile that are no longer available. Now, I'm going to give you a classic example, and this is before any of you could probably around. In the late 1950s, the Ford Motor Company brought out a car called the Edsel. And the conventional wisdom is that at the time they brought the Edsel out, it was the most researched car and thoroughly vetted car that Ford had ever made. But Edsel was, by the way, named after one of Henry Ford's sons. Well, the Edsel on the front grille had a, I'm trying to make this so you can see it, if you will, sort of had what looked like an O. And that was right in the middle of the grille in the front of the car. And I don't remember who said this, but a comedian said that there was a wreck between two Edsels because the two cars were trying to kiss each other. And more jokes came out about the Edsel, and joke after joke after joke after joke. It was on the market 2 years and was gone. Now, there are other products that fall into that same category. And there's some things that we do, supply and demand falls into this same scenario. And we demand something that's going to be sold to us as long as the supply is there. So we tell the manufacturer what we're going to buy. And when we say we're not going to buy it, we do something else. We buy something that's considered to be a knockoff or generic or some other type product. So this talks about pricing, and just notice here, and I'm not going to go through this a great deal. Manufacturer says, I want to sell a product for, it says here $50, so let's stock it. Let's stay with it. But nobody wants to buy it at $50, or very few. So the manufacturer notices that if he reduces his price, and here we're using 30 as a category, more people are going to buy it. So what's he going to do or she going to do? They're going to sell this product for $30. They're not going to sell it for 50, because the consumer, who is king in this country, has told them we're not going to pay for that. So this talks about the supply curve, and I don't want to get into this too much, or the demand curve. Supply is what's available. Demand is what's being asked for. We want this to be available to us to buy. And then you have what's known as equilibrium, which is very important to understand, and that is where the best, highest quantity of T-shirts can be sold. That's where the supply and the demand meet. Supply curve and demand curve. Same thing here with oranges. Notice there was a problem with oranges from Florida because of insects, and the price went up. So what happened is probably most likely fewer people bought oranges. We have 4 types of competition: perfect, which does not exist. We'll talk about that a little bit. Monopolistic, that's when several large concerns control the market. Oligopoly, which we don't see much of, and monopoly, which means there is usually one particular business, and that we find monopolies pretty much in things like utilities. And the reason we do is because it's very difficult and expensive for somebody to get into utility business. Free markets, open competition, opportunities for people to improve their economic standing by going to work. Notice the limitations. People may let greed drive them, something we must always be concerned about. This just talks about individual tax rates, and I'm not going to go into that because that's a different subject. Socialism is much different than capitalism or free market economy. Notice here that what they say here is that most basic businesses should be owned by the government, so we can take the profits and distribute them evenly. We do find entrepreneurs with smaller businesses, high tax rates because most consumers are protected, known as cradle to grave. Now, here's some of the benefits: the social equality. I'm not going to go through all of them. Free education, free child care, etc. Now, I want you to think about something. When it says free, there's an old statement in economics that says there is no such thing as a free lunch, and that applies here. You're paying taxes, and your taxes go to that education. Same is true if you would go to a public university in the state where you live and you're paying taxes. You're paying part of your education when you do that. And of course, the benefit that you get is there's some, you don't pay as much money. Here are some negatives. There's a brain drain. It feels that because entrepreneurship is not promoted as much and owning your own business is not promoted as much, some of the best people may leave for greener pastures, if you will. And there tends to be fewer incentives. Communism is actually socialism taken to the next level, if you will. Here the government makes most all of the decisions, most being in the high 90%. It owns most of the manufacturing and things of that nature. Prices don't reflect demand. So, they'll set the price of whatever they want, regardless of what people are demanding. And then notice that includes basic necessities like food and clothing. There are not too many true communist countries left in the world. You will find perhaps North Korea and Cuba, although I think we're going to find that changed somewhat. Mixed economies is where you actually have entrepreneurship and the government, neither a free market nor socialism. We do find some of that creeping into the United States today. Again, we don't have too many communist countries. I'm not going to talk about that. Economic expansion in Africa. This is always a funny issue to me. And the reason I say that is because we tend to think of Africa as not including countries like Egypt and Morocco and Tunisia and Libya and places of that nature because they're up on the Mediterranean Sea. And then we have South Africa down at the bottom of the continent, which is at the confluence of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans in some respects. So what you see here, at least to me, is that we're not talking about all of Africa. We're talking about pockets of Africa. People tend to sometimes speak of Africa as a country. Africa is a continent made up of can't remember somewhere between 40 and 50 different countries, maybe more. I may be wrong about that. So yeah, this is true what the slide says, but it's not universal to the entire plain of Africa, to all of Africa. Let me get that correct there just for a second. I went too far. Gross domestic product, I want to talk about. That's the value of goods and services produced by a country in a specific amount of time, specified amount of time, usually the period of a year. This shows the United States GDP. Then we have things that do affect the GDP, and that is unemployment. We have 4 types of unemployment in the United States: frictional, structural, cyclical, and seasonal. We're not going to go through each one of those, but what we do want to say is the unemployment rate is calculated. We'll talk about this more a little bit later, as the percentage of civilians age 16 and over who are not institutionalized. They're unemployed and try to find a job within the prior 4 weeks. I would prefer if we talked about our employment rate instead of the unemployment rate, but we don't. Unemployment rate was very high. It's now down somewhat around 5%, and perhaps getting better. Inflation is as it says here, a general rise in prices and services over a specific amount of time. And then we talk here about a couple other things, but deflation means prices are going down because there's too few dollars or too few people chasing them. And stagflation is kind of the reverse. The economy is slowing down, but prices are going up. We've not had that for a while, but it is around. Consumer Price Index, this is a big issue. It's the government's computation of goods and services. It's known as a market basket. Other things are put in there, and wages and rents, etc., also go into that. Some of that is very volatile, like energy prices, and so that changes. Producer Price Index, measuring prices at the wholesale level. And then we have productivity, which is a big issue for us. But rather than talk about productivity too much, let's talk about the business cycle. We have 4 in there. We have a boom, which we all know about. We have recovery, which means that things have been not so good and now they're getting better. And then we have 2 other things that we want to talk about here. One is recession. We had a great recession starting in late 2007, blossomed out in 2008, and we're still recovering from that. 2 or more consecutive quarters of decline in the gross domestic product. And then we have the GDP, the depression, which is known as a severe recession. And what I want to say here is that when the Great Depression was so named, the government economists selected depression as opposed to recession because they thought recession was a more negative term. There is a little bit left in this chapter. It talks about fiscal policy and things of that nature, but we're going to talk more about fiscal policy when we get to chapter 20. So I'm not going to discuss that here. I'd rather keep it fresh in your mind and talk about it at that time. It's 5:25. We'll take a break to 5:28 and we'll come back and talk about global trade. Please come back at 5:28. Thank you. All right, 528. We're going to now talk about Chapter 3, Doing Business in Global Markets. Learning objectives for this chapter. We're going to look at the importance of the global market and the roles of comparative advantage and absolute advantage in global trade. Look at the importance of importing and exporting, and look at some other important terms. Look at the strategies used in reaching global markets and explain the role of multinational corporations. Evaluate the forces that affect trading in global markets. Debate the advantages. I don't know if we're going to debate them. We're going to talk about them. And disadvantages of trade protectionism, and then discuss the changing landscape, of the global market and the issue of offshore outsourcing. All right. Over 90% of the companies doing business globally believe it's important that their employees have some type of international experience. And that's difficult to do in some respects. Why is it that we want to do business in global markets? If you would look at the United States, which is depicted here on the left side of the screen as you look at it, 7.4%, now that may have changed a little bit, of the world's population is in the United States. That means that 92+% is outside the United States. So it would make, as a matter of fact, I made a mistake here. That 7.4% is North America, which includes the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And so we need to think about that, and also extends down to South America, and then we see some of the islands off to the right of the lower part of the United States. Look at Asia, 60.2% of the world's population in Asia. Importing and exporting. Importing is bringing goods in from outside the United States. We're going to talk about the United States here. Exporting is taking our goods and selling them someplace outside the United States. We are the largest importing country. That may change as China grows and becomes more prosperous. Notice that we are the second largest exporting country in the world. And we're certainly not the largest by any matter of means. We find that countries with large amounts of resources, and notice the slider talks about Venezuela and Russia, don't have the technology they need to be able to get their product out. And if you know Venezuela, which has a very large amount of known petroleum resources, is right now an economic basket case. So it has some problems there, and that comes from the type of government they have and a few other things. Global trade, the premise of global trade. Now, I want to step back here just for a second and tell you that everything that has been promised in global trade, the benefits and the pluses of global trade, unfortunately don't always come true. Does that mean that we should stick our heads in the sand and say no to global trade? I don't think so. I think what it does say to us is that we need to pay more attention when we negotiate agreements to make sure that the agreements at least are neutral. What do I mean by neutral? It means that we're going to get as much out of it as we give, and vice versa. No country is going to become greater because of the way the trade negotiations have taken place. And free trade means that we should be able to move product across international boundaries without restriction and without economic barriers. This particular slide talks about the pros and cons of free trade, and it's difficult. And you can see this. I'm not going to go through these for you. You can see this graphically displayed at the top of page of 64. I think the big thing we need to look on the con side is that people lose their jobs, and we can't get away from that. That's going to happen. What we have to do is make sure that those folks, as I mentioned before, who do lose their jobs are somehow otherwise educated, that we can move them into something else. We don't do a good job of that. We really need to think about that. Two kinds of advantage. Comparative advantage simply means this. This is the theory of comparative advantage. It means that a country should produce and sell what it makes most efficiently, or manufactures most efficiently, and that it should buy products from other countries that it cannot make most efficiently. We don't always do that, but one of the things that talks about here is that's why the textile manufacturing has gone down in the United States. Textile manufacturing is still labor intensive. You know, what is our most, what costs us the most in the United States? It's our labor, what we pay our workers. And I'm not saying our workers should be paid less. Far from it. We have very productive people, and they should be paid for what they do. But it's labor intensive. We're not going to bring those industries back, unfortunately. Yes, there's still some in the United States, and some of those that are still here do well. But by and large, it's going to go someplace else where the labor is less expensive. Absolute advantage is something we probably don't see much of today, if we see it at all. And as a country has a monopoly on producing a particular product, and it's more efficient than anybody else is. At one time, South Africa had this with diamonds. I don't think that exists any longer. We find that small business or small businesses will be key to our growth in global trade, because right now there's only 1% of small business in the United States. By the way, by definition of the Department of Commerce, that is a company that has 500 or less employees. Notice that only 1% are in the business of exporting products outside the United States, and look at that, yet they account for 30% of the total of our exports. So we need to think about exporting as boosts the United States. And notice what the slide says there. This is one of these, I don't always like to get into these, but one I like to talk about. We estimate, the government estimates, that for every $1 billion in exports the United States gets or sells, that creates about 7,000 jobs. So that's something we need to really think about. Now we measure our global trade and things known as the balance of trade, then trade surplus and trade deficit. We don't have to explain surplus and deficit. We all know what those mean. So the balance of trade is the value of our exports measured compared to imports measured over a specific amount of time. These are some unfair trade practices, which you may not have heard of these terms. Dumping, that's simply selling a product in a foreign country, and we're talking about some other country selling it in the United States at a lower price than what they charge for a similar business buying that same product in their own country. Dumping is prohibited. It's prohibited by not only by us, the United States, but it's also prohibited by the World Trade Organization, yet it still occurs. 3 countries listed here have been accused of dumping, mostly steel and cement, although there may be others. And by the way, you can add South Korea to that category as well, especially with steel. Largest exporting nations and trade partners. Our top partners here, notice, are Canada and Brazil. And I don't think we always think about Canada as being that, but Canada is our largest trading partner. These are ways that companies get into foreign markets. And we're going to talk about some of these. We won't talk about all of them. Licensing, exporting, franchising, contract manufacturing, joint business ventures, and strategic alliances, and then finally, foreign direct investment. Licensing, pretty easy. Firm I own the license to make something, like, let's say, like Coca-Cola, and I provide a right to manufacture that and use the trademark in a foreign by a foreign company in a foreign country. So here, what are the benefits? I'm going to get money that I wouldn't, revenue that I wouldn't have gotten before, and it's not going to cost me too much to do this. Of course, there's a downside to that, and that is that the company may figure out how to do that. Franchising is another area we talk about, and most of us know about franchises. And we're going to talk more about franchising in the United States when we get to Chapter 5, but we're going to talk about here for a foreign country. The way to get into that is a contractual agreement. I'm going to allow you to sell my product, and I'm going to help you with some things like marketing and other things of that nature. And by giving you the right to sell my product, I'm going to charge you a royalty. And that is that for every chicken dinner you sell, for instance, if you're Kentucky Fried Chicken, you're going to pay me 10 cents. It may be higher than that, but whatever it happens to be. And of course, then I'm going to get a product that I wouldn't have seen or would have gotten other places. And of course, here's a number of people that we know are in this: McDonald's and KFC and all sorts of people like that. Contract manufacturing. This is a foreign company produces private label goods, and then the domestic partner being here in the United States, will attach its own brand to that trademark. It is a form of outsourcing. Notice what contract manufacturing can be used to allow a company to experiment in a new market. And if it does that, it's not going to have to incur a lot of expenses, and might also increase orders. A joint venture is when two companies get together to make a product that neither one made by itself. And the one that was here in the United States that did never come to fruition was a joint venture that was entered into by Toyota and General Motors, not General Electric, General Motors, in California. I'm sorry I can't tell you too much about that, but it was had great expectations and just didn't pan out for whatever reason. So here's some of the benefits you get. You share technology, and you also share the risk. You share management and marketing strategies, and you get to enter into areas that you weren't firmly into before. And because it's a joint venture, you may have easier access to the foreign market. A strategic alliance, perhaps that was the better firm. Now I would think of that GM and a Toyota thing. That was a joint venture. It wasn't a strategic alliance. Notice it's a long-term relationship, and the object here is to help each other. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But notice they don't typically share costs, risks, management, or profits. It's just giving you more access to the market and getting some other things as well. And then foreign direct investment is actually buying a company in a foreign market. You're going to own that permanent property, and it's businesses. And you can have subsidiaries, company owned in a foreign country by another company, Sometimes no, that's known as a parent company. I couldn't get that word out. Do have some advantage. If you're in charge, you're the parent, you maintain control over most everything. A disadvantage is that you're going to have to put up some money and technology within the foreign boundaries, and you may be subject to some rules and policies and procedures that you don't want to be. A multinational corporation is a company that manufactures and markets products in different localities around the world. And notice the big key here, multinational stock ownership and management. Notice also that not all global businesses are multinational because they don't meet that definition up above. And so it's very important to think of that. The term here called sovereign wealth funds, and I'm not going to dwell on this, but this is when a country funds controlled by governments holding investment within foreign companies. There's a danger there. We, the United States government, stopped a foreign entity from coming over and controlling the port operations out on the West Coast because they felt it was some issues there. So there's some issues down there at the bottom. I don't want to get too much into them because now we're into politics and we're staying out of it. We don't want to get politics into business and vice versa. Although we know that does happen. But it is a concern. It's going to be a concern. And when it is a major concern is when it affects national security. So we have to think about those types of things. That's not something that is within our ability to change. But if we don't like it, we should tell our elected congressman, congresswoman, or senator how we feel about that. These are forces affecting global trade. This list begins on page 73 in your text. Socio-cultural, economic and financial, legal and regulatory, physical and environmental. We're not going to discuss those. One of the things that affects us is the exchange rate. Now, we're going to talk more about exchange rates when we get to chapter 20. But what we need to know is when we have a high valuation of the dollar, which we have right now, it makes it difficult for our exporters because our goods cost more overseas than they do here, and it's something that is something we don't want to do, but it happens. I'll give you an example. The last time my wife and I traveled to Europe, we were in France a couple of years ago. The dollar was trading at about 137 to the euro. So what that meant was, if I wanted to buy €1, I had to give somebody $1.37. Right now, it's around $1.11, $1.12, somewhere in that range, and that's a huge difference. So on the flip side of that, it means that products coming into the United States from overseas, especially Europe, as I've talked about the euro now, are less expensive. So that's something we have to be concerned about. We do want a strong dollar, but we have too strong of a dollar. That affects our exports. So we do have things of devaluing it. Some countries are known as currency manipulators, and they'll do some things that they shouldn't do. It's difficult to catch people doing that, or to prove countries difficult to prove that what they're doing is causing harm like that. I don't want you to be too concerned about this counter trading. That's not something that any of us would do unless we got into being a money trader, or maybe perhaps work for a large bank or something of that nature. It's not a particularly important thing to discuss and therefore I'm not going to get into it. Legal and regulatory forces, we have to remember there is no global law. We need to know that laws are vastly inconsistent, and we also need to know that if you're a U.S. business and you're doing business outside the United States, you still must comply with applicable laws in the United States. These are issues that have problems with us because many countries outside the United States don't have good storage, transportation facilities, and infrastructure, and so that makes it very difficult. Trade protectionism is something we always have to worry about. Governments do that, and we do it to some extent. We'd like to think we don't, but we do. In other words, we prop up the price of oranges in the United States, and we find out that if we bought oranges from Brazil or Israel, they would be what we would pay for orange juice would be much less than what we do today. Tariffs is another way of trade protectionism. They are taxes placed on imports, make goods coming in more expensive. They really try to do this to prop up local businesses, but what happens is the local consumer has to pay more money than he or she would if they opened up competition. Two kinds of tariffs. The easiest one to talk about is revenue. You're just trying to generate money, charging a quote-unquote tax on product coming into the United States or another country. And then protective, which is what I talked about before without using that, raise the retail price of imports. And of course, you really actually harm the consumer. Another way to do this is import quotas, and say, okay, you can ship your product here, but only so much a year. An embargo is a total ban on any particular product. We've had an embargo on Cuban products since 1960. You cannot buy a Cuban cigar in the United States. You can go to Canada and buy them and bring them back, but you can't buy them in the United States. And there's the countries that we have embargoes on. I'm not going to talk about, I will talk about the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. This is trying to reduce restrictions on trade, make them free-flowing, and the World Trade Organization is the arbiter in trade disputes between countries. Now we have NAFTA in the United States, North American Free Trade Agreement, which a lot of people still don't like, was ratified over 20 years ago. And what we think is that the playing field was not as level as we expected it to be. These are NAFTA objectives: eliminate trade barriers, fair competition, investment opportunities, framework for more regional trade, and improving working conditions within North America. A couple other trade agreements around Panama, and of course we're also considering the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has been championed by the president, but is meeting a lot of opposition from people running for president and other offices. Outsourcing, we know what that is. It's where a firm contracts with somebody outside the United States to do some manufacturing. Notice that a lot of the outsourcing has gone on, and of course it causes a lot of problems. I'm going to come back to outsourcing in just a second. Pros and cons, we've talked about that. The con, of course, is the loss of jobs, and that is a big issue. All right, that brings me to where I want to end for this evening, except I'm going to give you a couple little stories here. All outsourcing is not bad. Now, a few years ago, the Procter & Gamble company, which is a rather large company most are familiar with, decided it no longer wanted to do its IT functions. It felt that was not a core competency. So it contracted with Hewlett-Packard to take over its IT functions. And they signed a 10-year contract. Hewlett-Packard came in, took over all of Procter & Gamble's IT functions, and the outcome of that was there was a win-win. Procter & Gamble gave up something that it felt like it could not do and could not do well, even if that was internal. And everyone who worked for Procter & Gamble in that department was offered a job to stay with Hewlett-Packard, and they didn't have to move. They were going to stay right where they were. So they were everything continued as it were. So everybody won in that situation. Procter & Gamble gave up something it didn't feel like it was good at doing. Hewlett-Packard got new business, and no employee was disadvantaged from that type of outsourcing, because that's what it was. I was outsourcing what I'm doing to a different company. Now, what we talk about here is offshore outsourcing. That's sending it outside the United States. And so normally when that happens, those jobs that were outsourced don't come back. Employees have lost their jobs and things of that nature. Yes, consumers can get lower prices, but sometimes the cost of that is more than what we want to pay for. All right, now I have two last things I want to mention to you. Our session, our presentation tonight is being recorded. Once we're finished, I'll upload that, and we'll have it uploaded to Campus Web tomorrow. I'll send you an email and let you know where you can find a recording. The second thing is today's lecture discussion question is: the authors of our text, Understanding Business, list a number of forces or factors, I prefer to call them, that affect global trade. As I mentioned before, we were going through the presentation, that those are found on page 73. Now, what I'd like for you to do, and this is the lecture discussion question, is which of those forces or factors do you consider to be the most important, and why? You must be certain to support your response. It's not sufficient to say, well, I think it's sociocultural. Now you have to say why you think sociocultural is the most important, and why it is, and why you believe that's true. And then, of course, you're to respond to one of your fellow classmates' posts, so we can enter into good dialogue here. You learn, your fellow student learns, I learn, and I'll interact with each one of you. Now, my normal rule is that I don't respond to forum posts until one of two things happens. Everybody has either posted or the time for posting has expired. By the way, I'm well aware that there's some confusion. So please, when you do your forum posts, look at what I have listed there as assignments. Use that to do your forum posting. You'll get into it and you'll see something that says something else. If it's not done in bold, that is a glitch in our system, and I cannot fix that. I've talked to the IT folks here, and I hope they can get it fixed. So look for what I'm saying. It's going to be in bold. When I want you to upload it, check the assignment days. That's when you're going to find it. Again, which factor affecting global trade do you think, or force do you think, is the most important, and why? And make certain that you support your response. One final piece of information. Next week's lecture presentation will be done on Tuesday. Monday, next Monday is Labor Day, and we're closed. So it will be on Tuesday next week. I will send you an invitation again, and we'll get started on time. I thank those of you who joined me tonight. Please feel free to ask me questions as we go along. You can type them into the chat box down there, or if not explained something very well to you, or you didn't understand what I said, send me an email, and I'll be glad to respond to you, and will respond to you as quickly as possible. I thank you for your attention. I look forward to speaking with you next week, and I will send you an email tomorrow to tell you where you can find tonight's presentation. It will also be available on YouTube, and I'll send that link to you as well. Thank you, and good night.